The thing about Cora Anselmo is that she never expected anything to arrive in the mail. Not in the 9 years since Dexter died. Mail brought bills and catalogs and occasionally a card from her cousin Diane in Wheeling, but nothing that required sitting down, and she had learned over 9 years of Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays to open envelopes standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down to read official correspondence felt, in a way she had never put into words but understood completely, like giving bad news a chair and a place at the table. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She was standing at the counter in her kitchen on Haywood Road, in the apartment she had been in for 3 years, when she opened the letter from Robert M. Calloway, attorney at law, on a Tuesday morning in March. She was wearing the gray uniform shirt from the previous day because she had come home too tired to change and had fallen asleep in it on the couch before she made it to the bedroom. The coffee was not yet finished. Outside, the early March rain was putting its shoulder into the glass, and the radiator in the corner was doing the thing it did, a ticking complaint she had reported to the building manager twice, and that had not been fixed, and that she no longer noticed except in the moment of first waking. She read the letter from Mr. Calloway twice, standing at the counter. Then she set it down. Then she picked it up and read it a third time. Sole beneficiary. All contents therein. She thought about Beatrice Vole. She had last seen her on the last Saturday of January, 6 weeks before she died. The old woman had been sitting in the small sitting room when Cora arrived, wrapped in a wool blanket with her legs up on the footstool, listening to the German radio. She had been 96 years old, and she had been 96 with the particular quality of certain very old people, the quality of someone who has been doing a thing for so long that the doing of it has become effortless. She had been old for a long time. She had grown excellent at it. Cora had cleaned the 5 rooms, and on her way out she had put the kettle on and made the chamomile tea and brought 2 cups to the sitting room and set one on the table beside Mrs. Vole's chair. The old woman had looked at the cup and then looked at Cora and said in her accented English, German beneath the decades, "You are the only person who remembers I take it without sugar." That was not quite true. There had been Tamara, the hospice worker who came twice a week, a young woman who was efficient and kind and who had been taking care of Mrs. Vole for 7 months, and it was possible Tamara also knew about the sugar. But Cora had accepted the statement for what it was, not a factual claim, but a different kind of claim, the claim of an old woman saying to the woman who came to clean her floors that she had been seen, that she was known. She had said, "I'll see you next Saturday, Mrs. Vole." She had not. Tamara called her on a Wednesday evening in February to tell her that Mrs. Vole had died on the previous Sunday in her sleep, in her own bed, without apparent distress, at the end of a life that had been what it had been. Cora had sat for a moment after the call with the phone in her hand. Then she had gone back to the dishes she had been doing, because that was how she had learned to take the losses of her life, by finishing the thing she was already doing before she let herself feel the loss. She had thought she would receive nothing from Mrs. Vole's estate. It had not occurred to her as a possibility. She had been a cleaner who came on Saturdays. She had drunk chamomile tea out of the blue and white cups. She had known about the sugar. These things did not translate into inheritance in the world Cora had occupied for the past 9 years, the world of work and holding on and being practical about what was and what was not. She would have been wrong about that. The letter on her kitchen counter said so in the quiet, formal way of legal documents. She had been wrong about almost everything, but that particular wrong was the only one she would later feel grateful for. She was 53 years old. She had been married for 19 years to a man named Dexter Anselmo, who had been a large and reliable presence in the world, the kind of man who took up a doorframe and knew how to fix a running toilet and laughed at his own jokes with the generosity of a person who genuinely found things funny. She had met him at 20 at a gas station on the edge of Wheeling, West Virginia, where he was filling a truck that belonged to his boss, and where she was buying a cup of coffee that cost $1.10 and which she had counted out from her jacket pocket in coins. He had held the door for her. It was that simple and that old a beginning. She had married him at 25 in the church where her father's family had married for 3 generations, and her father had cried during the ceremony, and her mother had held his hand and had not cried because her mother had the quality, which Cora inherited, of keeping the important feelings for after. They had had 2 daughters. They had rented, and then almost bought, and then rented some more. They have been comfortable in the way of people who earn enough and spend most of it, and do not have savings exactly, but have a life that holds together and feels, from the inside, like it is not about to fall. Dexter drove the same truck for 11 years and knew the name of every dispatcher and knew which stops would give you a coffee without charging and was, in the language of people who work with their hands and their backs, well liked. This mattered to him, and Cora had always known it mattered to him, and she had never held it against him that it mattered. Dexter died in April 9 years ago, on a Tuesday, in a parking lot, on his way back from lunch. He was 42 years old, and he had never been seriously ill in his life, and he had not eaten anything alarming at lunch, and there was nothing in his history that predicted the particular failure of his heart on that Tuesday afternoon. A man at the next car over had called 911. He had not regained consciousness. Cora was at the grocery store when the phone rang, and it was a nurse calling in the careful professional voice that nurses use when they are delivering the irreversible. She had been 44 for 3 weeks. She did not have time in the days after Dexter's death to understand what had happened to her life, because the children needed feeding and the apartment lease needed to be dealt with and Dexter's employer needed to be notified and the hospital bill needed to be handled and the funeral home required conversations she would have preferred not to have at that particular moment. She had them, one after another, standing at the kitchen counter with her notepad because Cora handled things at the kitchen counter with a notepad. That was how she handled things. She had been handling things that way since she was old enough to have things to handle. What she did not have, and what she should have had, but which Dexter had always meant to get, and had always meant to get, and had never gotten, was life insurance. He had been the healthy kind of 42-year-old that makes people believe nothing is urgent. He was the kind of man who would have gotten around to it eventually, which is a kind of man that exists until suddenly it doesn't. The arithmetic was simple, and it was immediate. Polly was 15. June was 11. The rent was due in 3 weeks, and the car payment was due in 2, and the checking account had $412 in it, and there was nothing coming in. She called her mother and her cousin Diane in Wheeling and Dexter's brother in Knoxville, and she made the calls from the kitchen counter standing up because there was no position for these conversations she was going to find comfortable. Her mother offered money she did not have. Diane offered to come down and stay. Dexter's brother offered condolences, and then condolences again when the conversation ran out of other things. He did not have money to offer, and he had said so plainly, which Cora respected. She respected plain statements above almost everything else. She had learned by the age of 44 that plain statements were the rarest and most valuable form of honesty. She sold the second car, which was in her name, that same week. She called the credit card company and the bank and the landlord. She made a column of numbers on a yellow legal pad, and she looked at the column for a while, and then she turned the page over and made a column of possibilities. The possibilities were fewer than the numbers. Her neighbor on the floor below was a woman named Rhonda who worked 3 nights a week cleaning commercial office buildings for an agency that placed residential cleaners during the day. Rhonda had been doing it for 11 years, and she was not going to pretend it was a dream job, but she was going to tell Cora that it was real work that paid real money and that the agency, called Bright House Services, treated its people decently. She said this one evening in the stairwell when she came across Cora sitting on the landing with the yellow legal pad and the column of numbers. The image of Cora on the landing would stay with Rhonda for years. It was, she told her daughter later, the most still she had ever seen another person look, not defeated, just very still, calculating. Cora called Bright House Services on a Monday morning. She started the following Thursday. She had not cleaned professionally before. She had cleaned her own home, which she had always kept well, but cleaning your own home and cleaning other people's homes are different in the way that cooking for your family and cooking for strangers are different. Not the techniques themselves, but the quality of attention required, the particular effort of bringing care to a space that is not yours. She learned this in the first week and she adjusted. She had always been a person who adjusted. Dexter had sometimes called her unadaptable, which he had not meant unkindly, but which was incorrect, as she had been proving, steadily, and without announcement, ever since. The agency placed her in 3 houses in the first month, all on the east side of Asheville, women in their 40s and 50s with children who were too old to need watching and with houses that were large enough to require help. She was paid $15 an hour plus mileage, and she was thorough, and she was never late, and she did not break things. And when she found a client's diamond earring under the couch cushion, she returned it the following week, and said where she had found it, and did not make a production of the honesty, because it was not something she considered a production. It was a thing that went without saying, and then, as she learned quickly in her new work, it did not go without saying at all because not everyone in this profession shared her assumptions about it. The clients who learned what she had returned and how she had returned it began to ask for her specifically, and the agency learned that she was someone they could give to new clients with the confidence that comes from knowing a person will not create problems. The work was physical in a way she had not been prepared for. She was 44 when she started, and she was not the 44 of someone who had been doing physical work for years. Her hands were not calloused. Her knees were not accustomed to tile. Her back was not used to the specific repetition of lifting and bending and carrying. In the first month, she ached in ways she had not known she could ache. She soaked her feet in the evenings and applied arnica to her knees and told herself that the body adapts, and she was right about that. By the third month, the aching had become something else, something more like a baseline, a condition of the body rather than a complaint from it. She was not ashamed of the work. She had been raised in a household where her father drove a truck and her mother cleaned the middle school in their district, and nobody had ever suggested that there was a kind of work beneath a person's dignity so long as it was honest, and you did it properly. She was not ashamed of the work. What she was, in those first years, was tired in two different ways simultaneously. The physical tiredness of a body that had not been accustomed to this particular labor, and the other kind, the one that lived in her chest and did not go away with sleep. She did not talk about the second kind. She had no interest in being asked how she was managing, because managing was what she was doing, and there was no useful answer to give about it beyond yes. She worked for Bright House for 3 years. At the end of the third year, she had 23 regular clients and had been asked by 6 more whom the agency could not place with her, and she understood that she had built a reputation that was worth more than the agency's cut. She went independent. She lost the liability coverage for 3 months until she could afford to buy her own, and she kept the referrals because her clients did not follow the agency. They followed her. She raised her rate to $75 for 2 hours and kept it there because it was fair and her clients believed it was fair, which is a different calculation from what the market will bear. She bought her own supplies. She kept them in the trunk of the Civic and replenished them herself, tracking what she used and what she needed and what she was going through faster than expected, because 11 years teaches you the rate at which things are consumed, and consumed things need replacing. Polly was 15 when Dexter died, and Polly had always been the daughter who understood the world through comparison. This is not a criticism. It is a fact about her, the way other facts are facts about people, and Cora had understood it from the time Polly was old enough to notice that other families had things her family did not. At school, Polly had friends whose houses had basements with pool tables, and whose mothers drove SUVs, and whose weekends had a specific quality of ease that Polly could identify even at 11, 12 years old. She had never been openly envious. She had just been watchful, in the way of children who have registered that the world is arranged unequally and who are already working out their place in it. After Dexter died, Polly's watching sharpened into something harder. She was 15 and she was grieving, and she had no language for the grief except the language of practical consequence, which meant she understood that they now had less than they had before, and that the less had a specific and daily quality. She did not complain. She did not ask for things that cost money. She picked up after herself more carefully than she had before. What she did, quietly, and with the specific self-consciousness of a 15-year-old, was begin to describe her mother's work in terms that softened it. She worked in home services. She was in residential management. These were the phrases Polly used when her friends asked about her mother, the careful language of a girl who had learned that some answers needed buffering. Cora noticed. She noticed the way she noticed everything in a house, not by looking for it, but by being attentive to what was there. She did not say anything to Polly about it for a long time, because Polly was 15 and in pain and doing what 15-year-olds in pain do, which is attach themselves to whatever they can control. What she did say, on an evening in Polly's junior year when they were in the kitchen together and Polly had said something about hoping nobody's mom came to the school because she didn't want anybody seeing the car, was, "I clean houses, Polly. That's what I do. It's honest work and it pays the rent, and I'm good at it. And there's nothing to be ashamed of in something you're good at that pays the rent." Polly had not answered. She had looked at the table. But Cora had said it plainly, and she had not said it unkindly, and she had not said it again, because some things need to be said once, and that is enough. June was 11 when Dexter died, and June handled loss the way some people handle cold water, by going in all the way without hesitating. She cried for months, openly, without embarrassment, in the specific manner of a child who has not yet learned that feelings should be managed. And then she stopped, and she had done the crying, and it was done. And she came out the other side with the quality she would carry for the rest of her life. The quality of a person who has looked at something hard without looking away, and who is not particularly afraid of what comes next. At 11, June started helping with the laundry without being asked. At 12, she was making dinner 3 nights a week. At 13, she grew her first container garden on the apartment balcony, 3 tomato plants and a pot of basil and a pot of thyme, and she tended them with the attention of someone who has found the thing she is for. At 14, she started working at the plant nursery on weekends, and the woman who ran the nursery told Cora that her daughter had an instinct for plants that could not be taught, that it lived in the hands. At 17, June could identify 50 varieties of native Appalachian plant by leaf alone, standing in a field, with the casual certainty of someone reading her own first language. June did not soften anything about their circumstances, not to friends, not to anyone. She told people her mother cleaned houses, and she said it the way she said everything, as a simple fact of the world. She was not proud of the poverty exactly. She was not romantic about it. She was June, which meant she was interested in what was actually there and not particularly concerned with what people made of it. Cora raised her daughters through the 9 years after Dexter with the materials she had, which were her own 2 hands and her own clear head and the income from 23 regular clients. She sent June to the community college when she finished high school, paid for it herself, and June studied horticulture and land management and graduated with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has learned the name for what they already knew. She sent Polly to the university in Raleigh, also paid for it herself, slowly and with the scheduling of a woman who understood what it cost to eat and pay rent at the same time. And Polly studied business administration and graduated in 3.5 years, and moved to Charlotte at 22, and was 28 now, with a husband named Marcus who worked in financial services and a daughter named Evie who was learning to walk. Polly had done the thing she had always been working toward. She had built a life with a different quality from the one they had lived after Dexter. She was not boastful about this. She held on to it with both hands because she had learned at 15 that things could be taken, and she intended to hold what she had built. Cora understood this and loved her for it, and was also, in the specific way of mothers, a little sad about the tension in her daughter's hands, the constant readiness for loss. She would think about this later, in the months after the letter arrived, when she understood what had been sitting in a house on Ridgecrest Road while Polly was in Charlotte, holding on to what she had. The size of the thing might have relaxed Polly slightly, but she did not know it yet, and Cora did not know it yet, and knowing was still many months away. She came to Beatrice Vole in the fall of 2021 through Marguerite Hooper, who had been a client for 7 years and who had the kind of dry, precise personality that valued competence above almost everything else, and who did not recommend people unless the recommendation was exact. She called Cora on a Thursday evening and said that her friend Beatrice was getting older and the house was getting away from her, and she understood that Cora's Saturdays were already occupied, but she would be grateful if Cora could fit her in, and that Beatrice was not an easy client in the sense of being warm and chatty, but that she was scrupulously fair and paid on time, and she thought Cora would find her interesting. Cora called Beatrice Vole the following morning. The old woman's voice on the phone was precise and lightly accented, German beneath the decades of American English, and she said, "Marguerite tells me you are thorough and that you do not steal things. I would like you to come Saturday and tell me your rates, and we will see if we can make an arrangement." Cora came on the following Saturday. She parked on Ridgecrest Road and stood at the gate for a moment before going in, looking at the house. It was a 1924 craftsman-style building in dark red brick with deep timber eaves and a covered porch running the full width of the front, and it had been very fine once. The bones were still good, visible under the overgrowth and the cracked driveway, and the tape across the crack in one of the upper windows. A cedar tree on the south side had grown so tall it was pressing against the porch eave. The plantings along the front fence, old boxwood and something that might have been camellia, had gone wild in the way of plants that were once cared for and then were not. A house, Cora thought. That had been fine once, and that was having a hard time remembering when. The woman who answered the door was small and white-haired and 92 years old, and she looked at Cora from the doorway with dark eyes that had retained their alertness through everything that had otherwise declined. She carried a cane that she did not need the way other people carry an umbrella, not because rain is expected, but because it is available. She was wearing a blue cardigan over a white blouse and gray trousers with a crease. She had the quality, which Cora recognized in certain older women of a particular generation, of having maintained standards because standards were what you had left when the other things fell away. "Come in," she said. "Tell me your rate, and I'll tell you what needs doing." She told Cora, as they moved through the 5 rooms she actually used, the story of the house in the practical way she told all her stories, in sequence, without elaboration or sentiment. Her husband Heinrich had bought it in 1962. He had been a dealer in New York, art specifically, and he had read an article about Western North Carolina and decided he wanted mountains for the second half of his life. They had been in the house until he died in 1979. She had been in it since, alone, with the assistance of various people over the years, a housekeeper who retired, a handyman who moved, a series of cleaners whose competence she assessed with the candor of a woman who had nothing left to lose by being direct. The rooms she used, the kitchen, the sitting room, the dining room she used as a second sitting room, the bedroom upstairs, the bathroom upstairs. The rooms she did not use, 9 of them, all closed, most locked. Her husband had used them. She no longer needed them. Cora had seen this before in very old clients. The house contracting around the person as they aged, the unused rooms closing off one by one, the life pulling inward to its essential functions. She did not find it strange. She understood it. A person who has been in a house alone for 40 years has probably arrived at the right number of rooms. She said she would take the 5 rooms at $75 for 2 hours on Saturdays, and she told Mrs. Vole plainly that she was thorough and that she did not steal things, and that if she found anything that seemed important or out of place, she would say so. Mrs. Vole looked at her for a moment with the dark, alert eyes and said, "That is a reasonable rate and a reasonable arrangement. Come Saturday." Cora came Saturday. She came the Saturday after that. She came 156 Saturdays over 3 years, give or take the 3 she missed in February of the first year when she had a stomach illness, and the 2 she missed in November of the second year when her cousin Diane came down from Wheeling. On the other Saturdays, she came at 9 and finished around 11, and sometimes, often in the last 2 years, she stayed for the tea. The tea was what the tea was. Mrs. Vole made it on the days the cleaning ran long, and the afternoon light fell through the sitting room windows at the angle it reached in the hour before the sun went behind the cedar tree on the south side. She carried the 2 blue and white cups from the high cabinet in the kitchen and set one on the end table beside her regular chair and one on the low table near the window, and she indicated by posture and by the direction of her attention that Cora should sit there. Cora washed her hands and sat. They talked sometimes and did not talk sometimes. The conversations were practical and specific in the way of 2 people who do not waste words. Mrs. Vole told her about the house's construction, the quality of the lime plaster in the walls, the way the cedar tree had been smaller when they moved in. She told her about Heinrich in the specific way of a person who still thinks about someone daily, but has reduced the references to what is bearable. She said he had been meticulous about his work. She said he had loved the mountains more than he had been able to love New York, which she suspected was true of a great many people. She said he had died quickly, which was the mercy of it. On one Saturday in the second year, when the afternoon had gone gray and the rain was at the sitting room window, and the German radio was playing something that neither of them could identify, Mrs. Vole said to Cora, "You came to this work after something happened." It was not a question. Cora said, "My husband died." Mrs. Vole said nothing for a moment. She looked at the radio. Then she said, "I also came to this, being old in this house, after something happened. After Heinrich died, I did not know what I was going to do with the days. So I stayed. I have been staying for 45 years. She paused. Staying is a thing people underestimate. Yes, Cora said. They drank their tea. They did not say anything else about it. There was nothing else to say about it that would improve on what had been said. In the last months, when Tamara the hospice worker was coming twice a week and Mrs. Vole was moving through the house with more care than before, Cora extended her Saturdays to noon without charging for the extra time, doing small things that were not quite cleaning but were adjacent to it. She replaced a burned-out bulb in the stairwell. She reorganized the kitchen pantry so that the things Mrs. Vole used most were accessible from a height she could reach without stretching. She tightened a loose railing on the porch steps. These were not things in her job description. They were things she did because she was there and she was the person she was, which is a sufficient reason for most things worth doing. The last time she saw Mrs. Vole alive, the old woman had looked at her from the sitting room chair, wrapped in the wool blanket with the German radio on low, and said the thing about the sugar. "You are the only person who remembers I take it without sugar." And Cora had said she would see her next Saturday, and she had meant it, and she had been wrong. And now it was March, and there was a letter on her kitchen counter, and the coffee had finished, and she poured a cup and stood at the counter and thought about a woman who had been old for a long time and who had grown excellent at it. She drove to 44 Ridgecrest Road that afternoon after the Pendleton house, where she had cleaned on autopilot through the morning with the letter in her coat pocket and the words of it turning in her mind. She drove down Merrimon and over to Ridgecrest and pulled up to the gate. The forsythia had come in since February, thick and yellow and slightly overzealous the way forsythia is in early spring. The house had its frowning quality under the eaves. The cedar tree on the south side was taller than ever. She got out of the car, and she let herself in through the gate with the key that was now, in a way she was still processing, hers. The rooms that were closed in the way of rooms that have not been opened for years, not locked, just shut, and the air in the hallway where they gave onto it had the quality of air that has been doing nothing in particular for a long time. She tried none of the handles. It was not her place to try the handles. She would make that decision later, when she understood better what kind of decision it was. She went back to the 5 rooms that had been hers to clean for 3 years, and she cleaned them. She was a cleaner. This was what she did in a house, and she did it now in the house that was hers, with the same supplies from the trunk of the Civic and the same sequence she had always used, starting in the kitchen and moving outward, because the kitchen is the center of a house, and you start at the center and move to the edges. She mopped the kitchen floor and cleaned the bathroom upstairs and changed the linen in the bedroom and dusted the surfaces in the sitting room and straightened the books in the small bookcase beside Mrs. Vole's regular chair. She did not know yet what she was going to do about any of it. She knew she was going to keep it clean while she worked that out. The house smelled of itself when she opened the front door. Old wood and the German dish soap and something else she had always assumed was the drafts of a very old house. A faint coolness beneath everything that she had never paid particular attention to. She walked through the 5 rooms she knew. The kitchen with the blue and white cups in the high cabinet. The sitting room with the radio unplugged on the window seat. The dining room with the drop cloth over the long table. The bedroom upstairs, quilt smooth, paperback mystery on the nightstand with a bookmark at page 211. She stood at the bedroom window and looked out at the back garden in its early March state and thought about the 9 closed rooms on the other side of doors she had never opened. The doors were hers now. The rooms were hers now. Everything in them was hers. She was not yet sure what to do with that. She went back downstairs and stood in the hallway outside the closed door of the library, the largest of the closed rooms, a heavy dark door with a brass handle gone green. She tried the handle. Locked. The hallway had 6 closed doors off it, all with the same dark oak and the same brass hardware that Heinrich had put in when he renovated in 1966. She had walked this hallway every Saturday for 3 years, pushing the cleaning cart. With her eyes on the floor she was mopping, aware of the doors on either side the way you are aware of the things you are not going to do anything about. She had never paused to look at them as she paused now. She put her hand flat against the nearest door. The wood was cool and smooth. There was nothing remarkable about it. It was a door. She thought about the 11 years she had spent in other people's houses, moving through rooms that were arranged around the lives of people who were not her. She had cleaned around the lives, respectfully, carefully, the way she cleaned around Mrs. Farnsworth's box of Christmas cards and the Pendletons' slowly repositioning reading chairs. You cleaned what was yours to clean, and you did not presume the rest. These rooms had not been hers to open. They were hers now. She thought, I will open them when I know what to do with what's in them. She put her hand down. She went to the kitchen. She went to the kitchen and made chamomile tea, because it was that kitchen and that was what you did in it. And she sat at the table and thought about what was behind the locked doors of the house she had been left. Her phone buzzed. A text from June. Heard about the house. Coming over Saturday, if that's okay. She typed back, bring your work gloves. The garden needs you. June arrived the following Saturday with canvas gloves and pruning shears, and the particular expression she wore when she was about to read a neglected garden the way a doctor reads a patient, looking for what was wrong and also what was not. She stood at the back garden gate in her jacket and looked at the slope of it, the overgrown planting beds and the paths that had gone back to brambles, and then she said, "This was an herb garden along the east fence. All of it. Someone planted this very intentionally a long time ago." She walked to the far fence and knelt and pushed aside a curtain of bramble and looked at what was underneath. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. "Lemon balm," she said. "And there, lavender. The old plants are still alive down under all this. That's remarkable." Cora looked at the fence and then at her daughter. She had known June would find something. She always found something. They spent that Saturday in the garden and the following Saturday opening rooms, one at a time, with the understanding that they would note what was there and not disturb anything until they understood what they had. The east dining room, larger than the one in use, furniture under drop cloths, a sideboard along one wall with empty shelves. The smaller sitting room off the back hallway, bookshelves and a window seat, and a small desk. The east room, which was what Mrs. Vole had called it in the one conversation where she had mentioned it, a room painted a dark green that had lightened with time, containing only a wooden chair and an old standing lamp. And then the library, locked. She found the key 3 Saturdays after the first visit. It was on a small hook inside the frame of the linen closet on the second floor, a hook set into the door frame at the very back of the closet where it would be invisible unless you reached your hand in and felt along the frame. She found it because she was going through the linen closet methodically, which was her practice, which was the practice of someone who had been cleaning other people's spaces for 11 years and who understood that the back of a closet is where the important things were most likely to be overlooked. She held the key in her palm for a moment. It was small and old, an older style than the front door key, brass but darker, the kind of key that goes with an interior door of a certain age and a certain purpose. She went downstairs. She put it in the library lock and the lock turned. The library was larger than she had expected. Running the full depth of the east side of the house, from front to back, it had the quality of rooms that expand when you enter them, that prove larger than their exterior dimensions would suggest. The ceiling was high. The walls, all 4 of them, were shelved floor to ceiling in dark-stained wood. The shelves were full of books in several languages, the spines turned outward, German and English and French of a reading life that had not been a small one. A large oak desk stood in the center of the room, bare except for a blotter and a lamp. 2 wing chairs faced each other before a fireplace on the south wall. A Persian rug covered most of the floor, its colors dimmed with age but the pattern still clear. She stood in the doorway and looked at all of it and did not go in immediately. Not because she was afraid. She was not a woman who was afraid of rooms. She stood in the doorway because something in the room made her want to take a moment before entering it. The way you take a moment before going into a space that has been waiting for something and is not sure yet whether you are the thing it has been waiting for. She went in. She walked to the east wall and ran her fingers along the spines of the books arranged there. They were clean. The books on the other walls had the very fine film of dust that accumulates on a surface even when it is cleaned regularly, the kind of dust that is always present no matter what you do, simply by virtue of air and time. The books on the east wall did not have this film. They were clean in the way that surfaces are clean when the air around them is filtered. She noticed this and did not reason it out in that moment. She was a cleaner, not a detective, and she filed the observation where she filed all observations about houses she worked in the part of her that paid attention to things without needing to immediately understand them. 11 years had taught her that the part of the mind that pays attention without understanding is often doing the most useful work. She opened the desk drawers. The center drawer contained dried pens and a magnifying glass and a small ruler and a folded piece of paper. She unfolded the paper. German, written in a careful hand. She did not read German. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She spent 2 hours in the library that Saturday, examining it thoroughly, and when she was done, she had found nothing that explained the cool air or the clean books except the fact of them. She locked the library when she left and drove home and made dinner and did not think about the cool air directly for the rest of the evening. She thought about it at 3 in the morning, the way unresolved things surface in the small hours when the ordinary noise of a day has gone quiet. She lay in the dark in her apartment, and she thought, books that are not handled gather dust. Books that are clean are either handled or the air around them is filtered. And the air in the library was cool, and still the way air is cool, and still when it is being deliberately kept that way. She sat up. She lay back down. She told herself firmly that she was a 53-year-old woman who had been left a house, and that she was probably overtired, and that the library was a library. She did not entirely believe this. She told June about the library and the east wall, and the cool air on one of the evenings June came to work in the kitchen garden. June listened with the full attention she brought to things that needed understanding. She turned her trowel over in her hands. She said, "What does the wall feel like?" Cora looked at her. "When you knock on a wall," June said, "a solid wall sounds different from a hollow one. It's the same with trees. You can hear it if you listen the right way." Cora drove to the house on a Monday morning, her day off, which she was still learning to use without the guilt of unclocked hours. She went directly to the library. She stood in front of the east wall. She pulled the reference encyclopedias from the lower shelf and set them on the floor. She pressed her knuckles against the panel behind where they had been, and she knocked. The sound that came back was not the sound of plaster and lath. It was the sound of wood over empty space. She ran her fingers along the back panel of the shelf, all 4 edges. On the right edge, toward the bottom, her fingers found a small concavity in the wood. An intentional indentation, the size of her thumb, pressed into the grain where no one would find it unless they were looking with their hands as well as their eyes. She pressed it with her thumb. The panel clicked. It moved half an inch outward. She pulled it toward her, and the entire lower half of the east wall section of shelving swung outward as a single unit, shelving and all, revealing behind it a dark opening and the top of a wooden staircase that descended into the darkness below. She stood with her hand on the shelving unit and looked at the top of the staircase. She did not go down immediately. She called Beatrice. Beatrice Lowell was the contractor Cora had hired in March to assess the structural repairs, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who brought her toolkit to everything and who had the directness of a person who has spent 20 years seeing what houses are actually made of. She arrived within the hour. She looked at the opening behind the shelving and then went to her truck and came back with a rechargeable work light. They went down together. Beatrice first with the light, Cora behind her on the stairs, which were solid and did not creak, built by someone who had thought about this carefully and had not done it carelessly. The room at the bottom was long and narrow and climate-controlled. An old system, old enough to have been installed in the 1970s, but running. The compressor was in one corner, behind a panel, running with the steady low sound of a machine that had not been asked to stop. The air was cool and dry and filtered. It was the air Cora had been noticing for 3 years in the library above. The cool she had assumed was a draft, and it was not a draft at all. Along the walls, in purpose-built wooden racks and on heavy-duty shelving, were objects wrapped in archival cloth, in acid-free materials, wrapped with the care of someone who had spent time thinking about how to preserve things for a very long time. Paintings, she could see the frames at the edges of the wrapping. Flat cases that held canvases. Small sculptures on padded platforms. Archival boxes on a shelf at the far end. And on a wooden table at the far end, a bound leather ledger. Its cover dark with age, a single word on the front in German that she could not read. Beatrice took photographs. She photographed everything: the room, the racks, the wrapped objects, the shelving, the climate control unit, the table, the ledger. She did it slowly and systematically, and Cora stood in the center of the room and looked at the wrapped objects and thought about Beatrice Vole sitting in the sitting room upstairs with her chamomile tea and her German radio, sitting above this room every Saturday for 3 years while Cora mopped the floor above her head. "Don't touch anything yet," Beatrice said. "Not until we know what this is." They came back up the stairs. In the library, in the late afternoon light, Beatrice looked at Cora and said, "Whoever built that room built it to last. That HVAC unit is old, but it's been maintained. You don't maintain something for 50 years unless you have a very specific reason to keep what's in it." "I know," Cora said. She had the note from the desk drawer translated that evening. She photographed it and sent the photograph to Stefan, a friend of June's who had studied German in college, and he called her back within an hour with a voice that carried the slightly altered quality of someone who has read something unexpected and is choosing his words carefully. Stefan was 27 and taught German at a language school on the East Side, and had known June since the community garden 2 years ago, and was the kind of person who picked up a call at 9 in the evening without making it a point. He said he would have it by morning. He had it in an hour. He sent the translation in a text message, the sentences broken across 3 separate bubbles the way text messages deal with length, and Cora read it on the kitchen table at 44 Ridgecrest Road with the old German text she had photographed spread out beside her on yellow legal pad paper. She compared them word by word, Stefan's English beneath the photograph. She was not someone who left comparisons undone. She thought about the voice in the German. She had lived with Mrs. Vole's voice for 3 years, the precise English with the German underneath it, the particular rhythm of a person who has been thinking in one language for 90 years and speaking in another for 60. The note, Stefan had said, was written in formal German, very correct, the German of an educated woman of a particular generation, and what that meant she could not say exactly, but she could imagine it. She thought about Mrs. Vole sitting at the desk in the library, writing the note, not knowing when it would be found or by whom, but knowing, with the certainty of a woman who had had a long time to think about it, that it needed to exist, that the right words needed to be in the right place for whoever was going to arrive. He read it to her in English. She wrote it down word by word on a yellow legal pad. "For the person who finds this room. This collection belongs to those from whom it came when those people can be found, and to the keeper of this house when they cannot. My husband assembled it with good intentions and some errors which I leave to you to understand. I am too old for these decisions. You are not me, but you are honest. I have watched you for 3 years. That is enough to know. Do what is right by it. BV." She wrote the last sentence twice. Do what is right by it. She looked at what she had written. She thought about what it meant to be watched for 3 years by a 94-year-old woman with dark, alert eyes, and to be found sufficient. To be found the right person. She had cleaned 5 rooms and drunk chamomile tea without sugar and tightened a loose railing on the porch steps, and she had been found sufficient. She called June. She read her the note. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She gave it to you specifically. Not to the estate. Not to an institution. To you." "Yes," Cora said. "Because she watched you. She watched what you were like when you thought nobody important was watching, and she decided." "That is what it says," Cora said. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to start by finding someone who knows what any of it is." The specialist Dr. Allison Farr came down from Washington 2 weeks later. She was in her early 50s, precise and still, with the quality of a person trained in the long-looking, the looking that does not hurry or presume. She went down the stairs with the work light, and she walked the length of the room slowly, and then she began, with gloved hands, to unwrap things. She unwrapped a single painting at 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in May and stood it against the wall and looked at it for several minutes without speaking. Then she made a call. Speaking in a low voice, she angled away from Cora. Then she hung up and looked at Cora with an expression that was careful in the way of a professional who has learned not to lead with what she is feeling. "Where did these come from?" she said. Dr. Farr moved through the room without touching anything, her penlight marking out canvases and frames and the stacked drawings in their tissue sleeves, her voice staying level in the way of people who have learned over long careers to keep professional composure in rooms that do not invite it. She asked Cora questions as she worked. How the room was accessed. How long the key had been on the hook in the linen closet, to Cora's knowledge. Whether anyone else had been in the house in the 3 years Cora had cleaned it who might have known about the library or the east wall. Cora answered each question as precisely as she could, which was the way she answered all questions. She had not expected the questions to take the shape they took. She had not expected to be asked when she had first noticed the drop in temperature along the east wall, which turned out to be a question with an answer she had not realized she was carrying until she reached for it and found it there. February of last year. She had been dusting the second shelf from the bottom, and the temperature had changed the way temperature changes when you move from one room to another, and she had noted it the way she noted everything and moved on, because noting was not the same as understanding, and she had not been in the room to understand things. Dr. Farr looked up from the drawing she was bending toward when Cora said this. She looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who is adjusting a calculation they had already made. You didn't mention it to anyone, she said. Cora said, I had no one to mention it to. Dr. Farr nodded. She went back to the drawing. Cora stood near the base of the stairs and watched the light move across the canvases. They were stacked in the racks the way you would store something you meant to return to. Not hidden, not concealed, but stored. There was a logic to the arrangement that became clearer as her eyes adjusted to the filtered light. The largest canvases at the back. Smaller works arranged by medium. The drawings in acid-free tissue with handwritten labels on thin cardstock in Heinrich's careful German. It was not a collection that had been thrown into a room. It was a collection that had been cataloged and tended and cared for by someone who intended it to outlast the caring. She thought about Heinrich Voll, whom she had never met and never would meet, a man who had been dead since 1979, a man who had fled Germany in 1938 with whatever he could carry and build a new life in New York in the way that a person builds a new life when the alternative is not having one. She thought about him coming to the mountains at 60. She thought about the house on Ridgecrest Road in 1962, still fine then, the cedar tree still a manageable height, the boxwood properly trimmed. She thought about him setting up the racks in the room below the library, arranging the tissue-sleeved drawings, writing the labels in his careful hand. She thought about the quality of mind it required to keep a ledger that recorded what you had paid too little for. The specific kind of honesty that insists on a record even when the record serves no immediate purpose, when it sits in a room for 40 years beneath a house on a road in North Carolina where no one will ever read it. She thought he was that kind of man. She thought she had known people like that. Not many, but she had known them. Her father had been one. Her father had kept a payment book for 32 years in which every transaction was recorded, including the ones he came out badly on, because he believed that a man who could not account for his own history could not be trusted with other people's. The woman who owned the house. Her husband. Her husband was Heinrich Voll? Yes. From New York. Originally Germany. Yes. She said she would need to come back with colleagues. She said Cora should not speak to anyone about the room until they understood what was in it. She said this firmly and without explanation, the way professionals say things when the explanation would take longer than the instruction. She came back on 3 subsequent Saturdays with 2 colleagues, a conservator and a provenance researcher who worked with her firm. They unwrapped and photographed and documented and rewrapped with the same care as the original wrapping. They read the ledger, which was Heinrich Voll's careful accounting. Every object in the room, dated, described, the price paid for each, the name of the seller when the seller was named, and alongside certain entries, in smaller notation, a detail that made Dr. Farr and her colleagues exchange looks that Cora, watching, could not interpret. She told Cora at the end of the 3rd Saturday what the room contained. 71 works, she said. 63 paintings, 6 drawings, 2 small sculptures. A range of periods and styles. Some painters whose names Cora would recognize, and a larger number she would not. The collection, based on current market valuations for comparable authenticated works and pending formal appraisal, had a total value of between $300 million and $500 million. The midpoint of that range, Dr. Farr said, is approximately $430 million. She said it carefully and without drama because large numbers said plainly are more comprehensible than large numbers performed. Cora was sitting at the kitchen table in the blue and white cup in her hands that had gone cold while she wasn't drinking it. She set it down. She did not move for a moment. $430 million. In the house she had cleaned on Saturdays for 3 years. In the room below the library with the cool, filtered air. Behind the shelving unit with the small indentation in the wood that she had found, because June had said, "What does the wall feel like?" And she had gone and asked the wall. Dr. Farr said, "There is more you need to know." The more that Dr. Farr needed Cora to know was not about the number. It was about the history underneath the number, which was, as she explained with the careful specificity of someone who had spent 25 years in this field, not simple. Heinrich Voll had been a Jewish art dealer who left Germany in 1938, which is to say he left the only way a Jewish man could leave Germany in 1938, which was with whatever he could carry or arrange to have carried, and without most of what he was leaving behind. Some of what he had brought out was his own family's property. His family had been collectors, the kind of German Jewish family of the early 20th century that had assembled over generations a domestic collection of significant works, not because they were wealthy exactly, but because they were educated and the education had been toward art among other things. He had managed to get these works out through a network of contacts and trusted acquaintances in the months before he left. They had traveled before him, and he had found them in New York, crated and waiting. These were his, unambiguously. No one had a claim on them but him. In New York from the late 1940s through the 1950s, Heinrich had also bought works from other European Jewish families who had come to America and who needed to liquidate what they had managed to bring with them. He had been a dealer. He dealt. The market of that period and that community had a specific character. Families who had survived what they had survived and who had arrived with works of art as their most portable asset and who needed cash, and who were selling in a market that was not always a fair market, where the buyers had the advantage and the sellers needed to move quickly. The price the buyer offered was not always the price the work was worth. Heinrich had bought at these prices. Not all of his purchases had been significantly below value. Some had been fair, or close to fair, or as fair as the market of the moment permitted. But some had not been. He had written this down. That was the thing Cora kept coming back to in the days after Dr. Farr told her. He had written it down in the ledger, in the small notations beside certain entries, not in the language of confession, but in the language of a man keeping an honest record. Price offered. Estimated fair market value at time. Seller circumstances, noted without elaboration. He was keeping the true account of what he had done and what he had paid and what the difference was, and he had kept it in a room under a locked library for 50 years, climate-controlled, preserved, waiting. His wife had known, or had not wanted to know precisely what she knew, which is a different thing, but is adjacent to it. Mrs. Voll had been the keeper of a knowledge she had not been given the full language to articulate, the knowledge of a house that contained a complicated inheritance, and she had watched a woman clean her floors for 3 years, and she had made a decision about that woman that she had recorded in a note in German in a desk drawer. She had been too old for the decisions. She had given them to Cora. Dr. Farr said there were organizations for this kind of work. The Commission for Looted Art in Europe. The Art Loss Register. Several American organizations that specialized in tracing provenance through the chaos of wartime and post-war dispersal, finding the families when families could be found, making restitution when restitution was possible, establishing funds when it was not. She said the process would take time. She said it would cost something. She said the ethical path was clear even when it was not convenient. Cora said, "Tell me what to do." She hired Patricia Howell first. Patricia was an art lawyer in Asheville, an unusual specialty to find in Asheville, but which Patricia had brought with her from 6 years in New York early in her career, and which she had practiced quietly and specifically ever since, because the specific intersection of art and inheritance and history creates problems that do not fit neatly into any other category of law. She came to the house and went down the stairs and walked the room and came back up and said, "This is going to be complex." Cora said, "I know." Patricia said, "The complexity does not make the right path less clear. It makes it more necessary." She hired David Levy, who drove down from Boston in June, a meticulous man in his late 40s who had spent 25 years doing exactly this kind of research, tracing the history of works acquired in the post-war period through the overlapping and sometimes contradictory paper trails of dealers and families and refugee organizations and wartime records. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger for 2 full days and made his own notes and told Cora at the end of the 2 days what he was going to be working with, which was complex and which was also, he said, among the most honestly documented collections he had encountered in 25 years of work. Whoever kept that ledger, he said, did not want his heirs to be able to say they didn't know. They knew, Cora said. Both of them. They spent 40 years knowing. He nodded. The knowing is why you have something to work with. The summer was the most unusual summer of Cora's life, and it was also, in certain ways, not unusual at all. She continued cleaning houses through July, because her clients had been with her for years, and she was not the kind of person who walked away from years of work without a proper handoff. She kept the Pendletons, who had been with her for 4 years, and the Kaufmans for 3, and a woman on Kimberly who had been a client for 6 years and who had recently had knee surgery and who needed the help. She handed the others to cleaners she trusted, calling each client personally and recommending someone by name and explaining what made that person good at the work. She kept a yellow legal pad on the kitchen table at Ridgecrest Road, the same kind she had always used, and she made her columns. What was owed to the room? What needed to happen first? What she needed to know that she did not yet know. The lists had the quality of all her lists, practical and specific and ordered by priority, though the priorities here were not like any priorities she had arranged before. She called her clients and arranged 6 weeks of coverage with 2 women she trusted from her years with Bright House, and she told them honestly that she had a family matter that was going to require her attention for most of the summer and that she appreciated their flexibility and that she would be back in the fall. Most of them said, of course. Some of them said she deserved it. And Mrs. Farnsworth said, "You've been giving us your full attention for years, Cora. Go take care of what needs taking care of. The Christmas cards will still be here." She understood in those 6 weeks what it meant to have work that was only this. She had not been without her regular clients for more than a week or 2 at a time in 11 years, and the absence of the routine she had built around them created a particular kind of space. In her days, not emptiness exactly, but room. The way a room feels different when the furniture has been rearranged and you can see the floor properly for the first time. She used the room. She drove to Ridgecrest Road every day. She sat in the library with the windows open in the June heat and she read Heinrich's ledger, entry by entry, with a dictionary app on her phone for the German she did not know. And she made notes on the yellow legal pad, names and dates and titles, and the prices Heinrich had written beside them in a careful hand, and she looked at the numbers and thought about what they meant and what they required. She had never thought of herself as a person who would have to make this kind of decision. She had thought of herself for 11 years as a person who made practical decisions, when to replace the vacuum, which clients to take on, whether the rate should go up. The decisions she was making now were not different in kind, only in scale and in what was at stake, and she found that she handled them the same way. Column by column, one thing at a time. Patricia Howell told her in the 3rd week that she was the most methodical client she had worked with in 20 years of art law, and Cora had said, "I've been doing accounts since I was 28. Numbers don't change character based on how large they are." Patricia had looked at her for a moment and then had written something down in her own notebook, and Cora had not asked what it was. She drove to 44 Ridgecrest Road in the evenings and on Saturdays and sometimes on Sunday mornings, and she sat at the library table with David Levy's research notes and Patricia Howell's legal filings and Dr. Farr's conservation reports, and she read through all of it with the care of a woman who understood that she was reading something that mattered to people she had not yet met. June came most evenings. She had started, without being asked, working on the kitchen garden in the evenings, and she worked until the light went, and then came inside and washed her hands and sat with Cora at the kitchen table, and they went over what had been found that week. June did not pretend to understand the provenance law or the art market, but she understood the essential shape of what was being done, which was that some things had been taken from people, and some of those things could be given back, and some could not, and the difference mattered and needed to be worked out carefully. This was, in June's framework, the same thing she did in the garden, which was to look at what was there and what it had been and what it could be returned to. The skills were not different in the ways that counted. David Levy found the first family in July. They were in Montreal. The grandfather had been a painter, not famous in the way that attaches to names everyone knows, but respected within his period, a man who had painted in Vienna in the 1930s with the specific attentiveness of someone who understood that what he was painting was already becoming history. He had come to New York in 1947 with his wife and 2 daughters and the paintings he had been able to carry. He had sold 4 of his own paintings to Heinrich Voll in 1949 for $400 each. David Levy's research into the period's market suggested the works had been worth somewhere between $600 and $800 each at the time of sale. The granddaughter was a woman named Claire Bergman, in her mid-50s, a teacher in Montreal. David called her in July. He explained who he was and what he was researching and asked whether she had any information about her grandfather's works. She said, "I know exactly which paintings you're calling about. My grandfather talked about those paintings for the rest of his life." Cora spoke with Claire Bergman by phone on an August evening, sitting on the back porch with the garden below her in the long light, and June moving among the herbs with her trowel. She told Claire who she was and how she had come to the house. She described the collection and the ledger and Heinrich's notes. She said the 4 paintings were among the works with clear, documented histories, and that she wanted Claire's family to have them back. Claire Bergman was quiet for a long moment. "Are you offering to return them?" she said. "Yes. Just like that. Just like that." A longer pause. Then she said, "Do you know what they're worth now?" "I know what the estimates are," Cora said. "That doesn't change what I'm telling you." Claire said, "My grandfather was not a foolish man. He was an educated man who understood what his paintings were worth. He sold them because he had 2 daughters to feed and 2 daughters to clothe, and the war had been over for 2 years, and he was still sorting himself out, and Mr. Vole had cash. That was what the world was like then. You couldn't wait for a fair price. If you waited, you might lose the chance entirely." "I understand that," Cora said. "He never said he was cheated," Claire said. "He said he had been in a bad position and he had made the best deal available to him, which is a different thing. He said this many times. He was very precise about the distinction." "Yes," Cora said. "He sold. He was not robbed. He was in a corner, and he sold for less than he should have gotten, and that was the world, and he understood the world." She paused. "But he didn't forget." "No," Cora said. "And neither did Heinrich. He wrote it down." A short silence. Then Claire said, "I need to tell my daughter about this. Can I call you back tomorrow?" She called back the following afternoon. She said yes. She said thank you. She said the paintings would mean something she could not find a word for, to her daughter and to her daughter's daughter eventually, to the continuity of her grandfather's work in the family that had always known what it was. The 4 paintings traveled to Montreal in October, transported and insured at Cora's expense, handled by Dr. Farr's team with the care of objects that had waited 70 years to go where they belonged. Claire Bergman sent a letter afterward. It was short and specific, written on notepaper with a small drawing of a bird in the upper left corner. It said, "You did not have to do this. You had no legal obligation. You only had the honest account that a careful man kept in a room for 50 years and the willingness to read it and act on it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole of it." Claire met Dr. Farr's team at the airport and drove with them to her home on the island of Montreal, a second-floor apartment with windows that looked south over a courtyard. She had arranged the wall before they arrived, cleared it, repainted it, the right color, a warm off-white she had chosen because her mother had described the walls of her grandparents' apartment in those terms, warm, off-white, and she had wanted the paintings to go back somewhere that felt like it was trying to be right. Cora had not been there. Dr. Farr had told her about it on the phone that evening. She said, Claire was standing in the middle of the room, and she was not saying anything, and she was just looking. That was all. She was just looking at them. Cora had said, that's the right thing to do with them. Dr. Farr had agreed. The other families came in ones and twos through the fall. A family in Tel Aviv whose grandmother had sold a painting in New York in 1951 under circumstances the ledger described with the same small, careful notation as the others, price below estimated fair value, seller's circumstances noted. They had not known the painting still existed. The granddaughter wept on the phone with David Levy and then composed herself and asked practical questions, which Cora recognized as the way people who are accustomed to managing things handle unexpected good news. They feel it briefly, and then they start figuring out what it requires of them. She thought about the families in the evenings when she drove home from Ridgecrest Road, when the day's work sat in her hands, and the autumn dark came early and the headlights on Marymount Avenue caught the leaves. 7 families in total found with clear claims. The process was different for each of them. The family in Tel Aviv was a man named Eitan Brewer, 63, who had a grocery business and who had been told by his mother before she died that she had sold a painting to a dealer in New York in 1949, a painting by a Viennese artist whose name she had written down in a notebook she kept until her death. The notebook still existed. Eitan had it in a box in his apartment. When David Levy contacted him with the name of the artist and the title of the work, Eitan had gotten the notebook out and sat with his youngest daughter and read from it for the first time in years. He called David back 20 minutes later. His voice was level, very level, the way voices get when the feeling is too large to fit in the voice. He said, "My mother said she sold it because she needed to buy passage for 3 people. The painting, or 3 people. She said it was not a difficult decision. But she said she always wished the man who bought it had paid her what it was worth. She said he seemed like a decent man. She did not understand it." David had brought this conversation to Cora that evening, the specifics of it, the passage for 3 people. She had sat with it for a while. She said, "What did he say when you told him we were returning it?" David had said. He was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said, in English, so there was no question what he meant. "This shouldn't be possible. This is not the kind of thing that happens." The family in Rotterdam was a large extended family who had been arguing, in a gentle and unresolved way, for 20 years about whether to pursue restitution claims for the works their grandparents had sold before the war. The argument was not about money. It was about what the pursuit of restitution meant, about how you understood the world, whether you believed institutions existed that would act correctly, whether the energy required was worth what it would cost in other ways. The contact from David Levy had not settled the argument. It had changed its terms entirely. They were not being asked to pursue anything. They were being called. The eldest daughter of the eldest daughter, a woman in her late 60s named Els, who was a retired schoolteacher, had been the one to receive David's initial call. She had told the family at a Sunday dinner. She reported later that the argument had stopped immediately and permanently, in the manner of arguments that are based on a premise that has been overtaken by events. The New Jersey family lived in Montclair, and they were second-generation Americans whose grandfather had emigrated from Vienna in 1935 and who had built a small business in New Jersey and who had sold a painting in 1951 to pay medical bills for his wife. His grandson was a retired teacher named Alan Schwartz who drove to Asheville in October to see the painting in person before the paperwork was complete. Cora met him at the door of the house on Ridgecrest Road and brought him down the stairs into the vault and walked him to the canvas and stood aside while he looked at it. He stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. The painting was a small interior scene, a kitchen, very old, Flemish, the light in it so particular and so contained that it seemed to generate its own source. Cora had spent time in front of it herself in the weeks since Dr. Farr's assessment, trying to understand why it held her attention the way it did, and she thought she had arrived at something like an answer. It was the light. The painter had understood light not as illumination, but as the quality that made the thing illuminated worth looking at. Alan Schwartz said, without turning from the painting, "My grandfather talked about it. He described it to my father, and my father described it to me. The kitchen with the light that wasn't like other light. I always thought it was my grandfather making it larger in memory. That's what memory does to the things you lose." Cora said nothing. There was nothing to add. He said, "It's exactly as he described it." She drove home that evening and sat in the parking lot of her building on Haywood Road for 10 minutes before going in. The parking lot had been where she lived her thinking for 11 years, the specific geography of a person whose thinking needed a car around it, the enclosure, the still engine. She sat and she thought about Heinrich Voll's ledger and the 7 families and the quality of the kitchen light in a small Flemish painting that an old man in New Jersey had carried in his description across 50 years so accurately that his grandson recognized it on first sight. She thought, some things are strong enough to cross that distance. The right things are. A family in Rotterdam. 2 families in the United States, one in New Jersey and one in Chicago. Each one a different conversation, each one a different shape of grief and history and the particular quality of people who have known something was lost and who had stopped actively expecting to get it back and who were now being asked to consider that they might. David Levy worked through the ledger entry by entry with the patience of someone who has learned that this kind of work cannot be rushed without becoming something other than what it is meant to be. In November, he gave Cora a summary. Of the 71 works, 24 had provenance histories clear enough to identify families or organizations with a legitimate claim. 14 of those had living descendants he could locate. 10 did not. For the 14 families, the process was restitution, return of the work itself, or, in 3 cases where the family preferred compensation, a payment at the full current market value. Patricia Howell handled the legal framework for each. For the 10 works whose original families could not be traced through any available record, Patricia and Cora established a fund administered by an independent commission. The fund supported organizations working with displaced families and survivors. It was, as Mrs. Voll's note had suggested, the right thing given the circumstances, and the circumstances did not permit a cleaner resolution. The right thing and the clean thing are not always the same thing, which is something Cora had understood since she was 44 years old, sitting at a kitchen counter with a yellow legal pad and a column of numbers. The remaining 47 works were Heinrich's, his family's. They had been in the Voll household in Berlin, and he had gotten them out, and they had traveled with him, and they were, by every legal and ethical measure, his to give and Beatrice's to hold, and now Cora's to determine the future of. The formal appraisal of the 47 came back in September. Patricia Howell called on a Thursday evening when Cora was washing a bowl at the kitchen sink. The number was $312 million. She turned off the tap. She stood at the sink with the phone in her hand and the number in the kitchen, and outside the window June in the garden in the last September light, doing something to the lemon balm that involved a small trowel and the particular quality of attention June brought to plants she had found under years of neglect and was bringing back. She called June in. They sat at the kitchen table with the chamomile tea, and Cora told her the full picture, the number and what it meant and what she intended to do. And June listened with the attention of someone who was both hearing something extraordinary and recognizing something she had suspected was coming. And at the end she said, "What do you need from me?" Cora said, "Keep coming to the garden. I'm going to need the garden." Gordon Blish had first appeared at the gate in April, 3 weeks after Cora had signed the probate papers and the property had formally transferred to her name. She had been in the kitchen with a tape measure when she heard the gate and then the footsteps on the porch. He was a large man in expensive casual clothes, and he had the smile of a man who had been practicing that particular smile in professional settings for 2 decades. He said he represented Pinnacle Residential Development in Charlotte, and that his firm had had an eye on the Ridgecrest corridor for several years as a potential site for what he called quality residential redevelopment, and that he wanted to discuss what he called mutually beneficial arrangements. She had told him she was not making decisions about the property's future and thanked him for stopping by. He called twice in April. She let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were warm and concerned, the concern oriented toward the financial exposure of a woman who had inherited a property requiring significant renovation and who might not appreciate the cost of what was ahead of her. He recommended a building inspector, a colleague of his who would give her a professional assessment at no cost to herself. She called the inspector's number and asked how she had been given it, and when the woman said Pinnacle Residential Development, Cora thanked her and said she had already engaged a contractor. He called in May and June and twice in July, each call warmer and more concerned than the last. By July, the concern had shifted from renovation costs to the particular complexity of historic properties with what he called historical significance, which was his way of telling her that word had reached him about the collection without saying so directly. She stopped returning his calls in May, and she did not start again. In October, with the press coverage of the restitution process beginning to accumulate in the art law community and with a brief mention in the Asheville Citizen-Times, Blish left a voicemail that was different from the others. The warmth was thinner and the urgency was nearer the surface. He said his firm had a client interested in acquiring the property after the collection situation had been resolved, at a price that reflected the historical significance of the site. He said the price was $22 million. Cora called him back. She said, "The collection has been appraised. $22 million is not a strong price." He said, "The Providence situation creates uncertainty. There are risks." She said, "The Providence questions have been addressed. The remaining collection is fully cleared. I have documentation." There was a pause. She said, "I am not selling, Mr. Blish." He said he strongly encouraged her to reconsider. She said she appreciated his encouragement. She heard nothing directly from him for 2 weeks. Then a reporter from a Charlotte business magazine called Patricia Howell's office asking about the Voll collection. The piece that ran in November used the particular neutrality of a piece written by someone who has been given a specific set of questions by a specific set of interested parties. It asked whether the owner of the collection had the experience and resources to manage a discovery of this scale responsibly. It cited unnamed sources close to the estate. It noted the unresolved provenance questions as if the resolution process ongoing for 5 months did not exist. It noted that the owner had been, prior to the inheritance, a residential cleaner. Said plainly, as a fact, without inflection, in a way that was designed to carry its own weight. Patricia Howell read the piece the morning it was published. She called Cora and said, "This is a pressure campaign." Cora said, "How would you like to respond?" Patricia said, "Publicly and specifically." The press event was held at 44 Ridgecrest Road on a Thursday morning in December. The forsythia at the front gate had gone quiet for winter, and the apple tree along the east fence was bare but present, holding its shape against the cold sky. Cora stood on the front porch in a good coat she had bought in October, and she read a statement she and Patricia had worked on for 2 weeks. 3 reporters came to the press event, and one of them was from the Mountain Arts publication and had her audio recorder running and her notebook open and the quality of someone who understood that this was not a story about real estate development. 2 representatives from the Asheville arts community attended, one from the museum and one from the Arts Council, both of whom had been contacted by Patricia Howell in the week prior with a brief summary of what had been found and what had been done with it, and both of whom had agreed to attend without being told what to expect, which was the kind of trust that takes years to build and which Patricia had built. June was there, standing near the garden gate in her work jacket. Because June had been part of this from the Saturday, she arrived with canvas gloves and pruning shears, and she was not going to be absent when her mother stood at the front of the house they had spent 6 months working on together and said the things that needed saying. Cora had not asked her to come. She had not needed to. Cora stood on the front porch steps, where the forsythia had come back in the 6 months since June started working on it, and was doing what forsythia does in December, which is look like it is waiting for the right season. And she spoke without notes because she had been through the information enough times with Patricia and David and Dr. Farr that it lived in her now, the facts and their sequence and their meaning. And she did not need a page to remind her of what had happened in the room. Below her own feet, she described the collection and its history. She described the provenance research in specific terms, naming the works returned, the families who had received them, the fund established for those whose original owners could not be traced. She described what remained. She described what she intended to do with it. She said Mrs. Vole had left a note asking her to do right by it, and she was doing right by it. She said, "The foundation will be called the Vole Holloway Foundation. Its work will support this house as a community space in Asheville and art restitution research nationally." She did not say anything about Gordon Blish. She did not say anything about the November article. The truth, laid out specifically and in sequence, was sufficient to make both of them unnecessary. The piece that ran 3 days later was in a different publication and was written by a different reporter and described specifically what had been done with the collection, including the names of the families, and what had been returned to them. It described Cora accurately, a residential cleaner of 11 years who had been left a house by an elderly client and who had spent the following year doing what the client had asked of her. The reporter had called Claire Bergman in Montreal, who had said, "She returned 4 paintings my grandfather sold under duress 70 years ago. She had no legal obligation. She had only the honest record kept by a careful man and the willingness to honor it." Claire's sentence was the one that traveled. Gordon Blish did not call again after the press event. His colleague called once in January, a woman who introduced herself as a conciliation specialist and who was, in Cora's estimation, a more skilled version of the same approach, and who was also told by Patricia's assistant that the property was not for sale and would not be. Polly drove up from Charlotte the week before Christmas with Marcus and Evie. She had called ahead and said she wanted to see the house properly this time, which was Polly's way of acknowledging that May had not been a proper seeing. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon. June had strung Christmas lights through the front rooms, and the tree was up in the parlor, and the house had the quality of a house preparing to be lived in again, which was what it was doing. Polly walked through the rooms slowly. Marcus held Evie on his hip. Evie was at the age where everything needed to be touched, and she kept reaching for things, and Marcus redirected her with the patient good humor of a man who had discovered fatherhood was the best thing that had happened to him. They sat in the kitchen with coffee, and Polly looked around the room, the blue and white cups in the high cabinet, the window over the garden, the kitchen table that had been here since the voles, refinished now, but solid and unchanged in the ways that mattered. Polly wrapped both hands around her mug. She said what she had come to say. "I want to apologize," she said. "For May. For how I talked about the house." "You were being practical," Cora said. "I was being something else too. I was being afraid. The way I've been afraid since Daddy died. That there wasn't going to be enough. That something was going to take it all away." She stopped. She looked at her coffee. "I've been living like that for 9 years, and I never quite stopped." Cora reached across the table and put her hand over Polly's hand. "I kept thinking you were going to be left with nothing," Polly said. "All those years. I kept thinking it was going to go wrong." "I know," Cora said. "And it didn't." "No." Cora looked at her daughter. "It went differently." Polly's eyes went wet. She was 28 years old, and she had Marcus's arms around her in the evenings, and her daughter learning to walk in their living room in Charlotte, and a life that was good. And she had been afraid inside all of it since the Tuesday afternoon in April 9 years ago, when a nurse had called with a carefully calibrated voice delivering what could not be delivered gently. She had been waiting for everything to fall apart for 9 years, and it had not fallen apart. And the reason it had not fallen apart was sitting across the kitchen table with her hand over hers. That night, after June's dinner, which was the kind of dinner a person cooks when they are good at it and cooking for the people they love, they sat around the kitchen table, and the Christmas lights put their warm glow into the hallway, and the house held them the way houses are meant to hold people. Evie was asleep against Marcus's shoulder, and Marcus held her with the stillness of a man who does not want to be the reason a sleeping child wakes. June was telling a story about the apple tree and what it was going to do in the spring. Polly was laughing at the story, properly laughing, without the management of it. Evie fell asleep in the armchair by the window around 9 o'clock, her small body folded into the crook of the chair with the complete surrender of a child who has eaten well and been held enough. Marcus carried her upstairs without waking her. He had that quality, which Cora had noted the first time she met him, of a man who is genuinely good at the physical vocabulary of family, the carrying and the settling and the smoothing of the blanket. June washed the dishes. She had cooked, and she was going to wash the dishes also, and there was nothing to argue about this. June's position on the kitchen was total. Polly sat at the table after Marcus went upstairs, and she helped Cora clear the serving dishes, and they did it in the comfortable quiet of two people who have been in the same kitchen a long time. Polly said, after a while, "What does it feel like to have it?" Cora thought about the question. She said, "It feels like a responsibility that I'm trying to do right by." "That's not what I meant," Polly said. "I know you're doing right by it. I meant, what does it feel like inside?" Cora set a serving bowl in the cabinet where she had decided serving bowls belonged, which was the high cabinet because the kitchen was hers now and she could decide. She thought about what Polly was actually asking. She said, "Do you remember when your father used to get home from a long run? You remember how he would come in the back door and set his bag down and the sound of the bag hitting the floor? That particular sound." Polly was quiet. She remembered. The bag had been a canvas duffel with a broken zipper on the side pocket, and it made a particular solid sound when it landed on the linoleum. Cora said, "That sound meant something was done. Something hard and specific was done, and he was home. That's what it feels like. Something that needed doing has been done." June turned from the sink without saying anything. She turned back. Polly said, "I thought you'd be more excited." "I am not an excited person," Cora said. This was true, and they both knew it was true. Polly looked at her mother with the specific expression of someone who has grown up watching a person be themselves, and who has not finished arriving at what to make of it. There was something in it that was not quite admiration and not quite frustration. Some combination of both that did not have a name, but that was not, Cora thought, a bad thing to leave your daughter with. Marcus came back downstairs. June made tea. They sat at the kitchen table, the four of them, in the house that had been cleaned for 3 years, and that had been inherited in March, and that had held for 60 years a room full of paintings below a room full of books. And it was December in Asheville, and the night outside was the particular blue of December nights in the mountains, and they sat. Cora sat at the end of the table with her chamomile tea and looked at all of it. She thought about Beatrice Vole sitting in this kitchen on Saturday mornings, listening to the German radio, waiting for Cora to finish the library floor so she could make the tea. She thought about the note in the desk drawer and the key on the hook in the linen closet and the clean books on the east wall and the cool air she had been noticing for 3 years without understanding it. She had been cleaning this kitchen for 3 years. Now it was hers. The blue and white cups and the German dish soap and the kitchen table and the window over June's garden. And the 47 paintings on loan to the Asheville Art Museum 3 miles away, where they were being prepared for an April exhibition. And the foundation that would open with grants to 3 restitution organizations in January. And the rooms on the ground floor that would open to the community in September. And the apple tree along the east fence that June said would be extraordinary this year. She sat at the table with her tea in the December night, and the people she loved in the room with her, and she thought about 11 years of cleaning other people's floors, and she thought, I am trying to do right by it. She thought that was the whole of what could be asked of a person. To try and to keep trying, and to be honest about the difference between what was done and what was owed. The Vole collection opened at the Asheville Art Museum on the second Saturday of April. 20 of the 47 paintings hung in 2 galleries on the second floor, lit with the careful professional lighting that shows a painting as itself rather than as an idea of itself. The show was called Kept, the Vole Family Collection, Asheville, 1924. Patricia Howell had suggested the title, and Cora had liked it immediately for the plain statement of what the collection was. Kept, held, preserved through everything. Cora attended the opening with June and Polly, who drove up with Marcus and Evie. She stood in the first gallery in front of a painting she had pulled out of archival wrapping in a climate-controlled room below a library, and she looked at it. It was a scene, a field in autumn, a line of trees at the far edge, the quality of afternoon light specific enough to belong to a particular afternoon in a particular place, the light of someone who had been there and had looked long enough to understand it, and had kept looking until he understood it well enough to paint it. She had not known the painter's name until December. She knew it now. She had read everything David Levy and Dr. Farr could give her about him, and she had stood in front of his work in the room below the library on several mornings in the fall, with the work light and the archival wrapping aside, just looking. And what she had understood was that the person who painted these things had understood light, and had understood fields, and had carried that understanding across an ocean and into a house in the mountains of western North Carolina, where it had been kept in the dark in a climate-controlled room for 50 years, and was now on a wall where people could see it. That painting was one of the ones not being returned. It had been in Heinrich's family since before his birth. His grandfather had bought it from the painter directly, in Vienna, had hung it in the family home, had never sold it. It had traveled with Heinrich and had been in this house since 1962, and it was Cora's now, as fully and as clearly as the house was hers. Claire Bergman came to the opening. She had flown from Montreal, and she brought her daughter, who was in her early 30s, and her daughter's small daughter, who was 3 and who had the quality of 3-year-olds at museums, which is to say she was interested in everything for 5 seconds and then interested in something else. Claire found Cora in the first gallery, and they stood together in front of one of the autumn field paintings, one of the 4 that had come back, and they were quiet for a while. Claire said, "My grandfather would have liked you." Cora said, "I think I would have liked him." They stood in the gallery with the paintings and the careful light and the particular quiet of a room where people have agreed to pay attention, and Cora thought about the morning in October 2021 when she had come to 44 Ridgecrest Road for the first time and looked at the house from the gate, the frowning porch and the cracked driveway, and the tape across the upper window. She thought about 3 years of Saturdays. She thought about the cool air and the clean books and the small indentation in the wood. She stayed at the exhibition for 2 hours. She walked through it 3 times, once with Claire, once with June, once by herself. The museum had organized the works chronologically by acquisition, which meant Heinrich's New York years told a kind of story in sequence. The works he had bought from the refugees, and the works he had bought at fair price, and the works he had owned since Germany, all of it together, and the effect was of a collection that was also a record, a man's professional life laid out in what he had chosen. The wall text beside each painting had been written by the museum's curator, who had worked with Dr. Farr's documentation and David Levy's provenance research over the preceding 4 months, and the text for the 7 returned works noted the names of the families to whom they had been restituted and the year of the return. 7 small plaques on 7 empty spaces on the wall where the paintings were no longer hanging because they had gone home. Cora had not thought about how the empty spaces would look until she saw them. She stood in front of one for a while, the blank pale rectangle where a painting had been, the small plaque with the family name. The absence, she thought, was part of the exhibition too. The right kind of absence. The kind that means something was put right. A man she didn't know came to stand beside her. He was older, 70s, with the careful posture of someone with an old back injury. And he looked at the empty rectangle for a moment and then looked at Cora. He said, "I read about this in the paper." Cora said, "Yes." He said, "You're her. The woman who found it." She said, "I cleaned the house." The room was already there. He considered this. He said, "Still." She said, "Yes. Still." He walked on. She stood for another moment in front of the empty rectangle, and then she walked on too. June found her in the last room of the exhibition, where the three largest works hung. The canvases Heinrich had brought from Germany in 1938, the works that had survived the crossing and the New York years, and the move to the mountains and 40 years in the climate-controlled room below the East Library wall. They were very large, and they were very good, and the museum's lighting was doing what good museum lighting does, showing you that the light was already in the thing before the lighting arrived. June stood beside her mother in front of the largest canvas, which was a mountain scene, not these mountains but mountains of the same quality, the same blue distance, the same sense of looking at something that will outlast the looking. June said, "She picked the right person." Cora said, "I know." June said, "I just want to say it." "I know," Cora said again. "Thank you." They stood in front of the painting for another few minutes, her youngest daughter beside her, in the good light. She thought about how close she had come, in those 3 years, to not noticing. How many times she had run her hand along the shelves of the east wall and not knocked. How the answer had required June to say a single practical sentence. "What does the wall feel like?" And Cora had gone and asked the wall. Everything that had come from that moment, the families and the restitution and the foundation and the exhibition and Claire Bergman standing beside her in the gallery, had come from that. From June saying, "What does the wall feel like?" and Cora going to the house on a Monday and knocking. That was how it worked. Not a single miraculous discovery, but a series of small attentions. Each one so ordinary it barely registered in the moment, each one building on the one before it. The clean books, the cool air, the key in the linen closet, the indentation in the wood. 11 years of cleaning other people's houses had taught her to pay attention to surfaces and to what surfaces did and did not do. She had used that attention. She had used it without knowing she was using it, and then she had understood she was using it, and she had kept going. In June, she drove to Wheeling for a week. She stayed with her cousin Diane in the house where Diane had lived for 20 years, on the same street where they had grown up, or close enough to the same street that it felt like returning to something recognizable. She visited the middle school where her mother had cleaned, which was still a middle school. She drove out to the factory where her father had worked, which was now a distribution warehouse. She walked around the neighborhood and looked at what was the same and what was different. Diane was 61 and had lived in the same house since she married at 24. A brick colonial on a street lined with maples that went extraordinary in October and were just themselves in June, green and complete and not performing anything. Cora had not been back to Wheeling in 3 years, the years having been what they were, and the house felt the same in the way that houses where nothing much changes feel the same. The same furniture in the same positions, the same smell of coffee, and the same dog. A different dog, but the same temperament. A yellow lab who greeted her at the door with the democratic enthusiasm of a creature who loves everyone but means it. Diane had not made a production of The Inheritance. She had called when the news reached her in March, and she had said, "That is extraordinary." And then she had said, "Are you all right?" And then she had said, "Good, because you deserve to be all right." She had not asked for details, she was not given or made statements that required Cora to respond with gratitude or reassurance. She was the right kind of family, Diane, the kind that takes you as you are and asks one question and waits for the answer. They sat on Diane's back porch in the evenings with iced tea and talked about the things they always talked about, Diane's son in Columbus, the neighbor whose roof had finally been repaired after 3 years of argument with the insurance company, the dog, who was named Rupert, and who lay between their chairs with the contentment of an animal who has correctly assessed the situation. On the third evening, Diane said, "You look different," and Cora said, "I'm the same," and Diane said, "You look like someone who knows what she's for." And Cora thought about that. She had not put it in those terms herself, but she looked at the term and she thought it was accurate. She had not known, for a long time, in the years after Dexter, what she was for beyond the work and the daughters. The work had been enough. The daughters had been more than enough. But something else had been missing, some quality of direction that pointed beyond the immediate, and she had not named it missing because she had been too busy for the naming. The collection and the families and the foundation had given it a name. She was for the doing right of complicated things. That was what she had been made for, the patience and the precision and the refusal to leave the room before the thing was finished. She had learned this in 11 years of cleaning other people's houses. She had practiced it every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. She had just not known what she was practicing for. On the last day of the visit, she went to the cemetery where her parents were buried. She had not been in 4 years, which was too long, and she stood at the headstones for a while. Her parents had been people who worked and who held on and who had pressed into her, without saying so in those exact words, the belief that a thing worth doing was worth doing right. She had done a thing. She was trying to do it right. She thought they would have understood her and been satisfied with what she was doing, which is what a person hopes for when they stand at the graves of people who raised them. She drove back to Asheville on a Sunday in July with the windows down on the interstate and the mountains rising in the west, blue, with distance in the summer heat. She came down the exit and through the streets and pulled up to 44 Ridgecrest Road and let herself in through the gate. She parked on Ridgecrest Road and went inside. The house was empty in the particular way it was empty in the evenings in summer, the late lights still in the rooms, the cedar tree casting its long shadow through the sitting room windows. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. She got the blue and white cups down from the high cabinet, both of them, because that was how she always did it. 2 cups. The habit of 3 years having become the habit of this house. The second cup standing in for the woman who was no longer there and who had decided, in whatever deliberate way she had decided things, that Cora was the right person to stand in the kitchen and reach for the chamomile and fill 2 cups. She had been thinking, on the drive back through the mountains, about what Diane had said. Knowing what you're for. She had been turning it over in the way she turned things over when she had 7 hours of interstate to do it in. She thought about the thing it was missing, the part of the description that wasn't quite complete. It wasn't only knowing what you were for. It was arriving at what you were for through the work you had been doing, through the work itself, which was what made it different from ambition or luck or any of the other things people said about themselves and their circumstances. She had not planned toward this. She had only worked. She had only paid attention. And the attention, applied honestly over 11 years to the surfaces and temperatures and sounds and silences of other people's houses, had found the thing it was for. The kettle boiled. She poured the water. She carried the 2 cups to the sitting room and set one on the end table beside the chair where Mrs. Vole had always sat and held the other in her hands and looked out through the cedar tree at the evening, coming down over the mountains. She was 53 years old, and she was in the right place at the right time doing the right thing, and she knew this, and the knowing had the quality of a door that has been opened from the inside. The garden was full that evening. June had brought tomato plants in May, and they were thick along the back fence now, and the herbs were up along the west side of the garden, and the old apple tree had shed its blossoms months ago and was carrying small green fruit along its branches. The forsythia at the front gate that had been planted 30 or 40 years ago to screen the gate had been cut back in March and was coming in again with the quality of something that has been waiting to be properly tended. The house stood as it had stood for 100 years, a little frowning still under the eaves, the dark red brick and the heavy timber trim with the covered porch running the width of the building, the repaired steps, the properly paned windows. She sat on the front porch with her chamomile tea and the particular light of a July evening in the mountains, and she thought about Beatrice Vole, who had sat on this porch. She thought about Heinrich Vole, who had built a room under his house and put into it the things that mattered most to his family, and who had died with the key to that room in the house, and who had trusted that someone would find it, had trusted that the house would eventually go to someone who would look carefully enough to find it. She thought about the note in German and the blue and white cups in the cabinet above the range, and the chamomile tea on Saturday mornings, and what it means when an old woman watches a person at work for 3 years and decides, this one. The foundation's first grants had gone out in January to 3 organizations working on art restitution research. The community rooms had opened in September, 2 galleries on the ground floor for local artists and 2 spaces for educational programming. And the rest of the house was chorus, which meant the kitchen and the sitting room and the library and the bedroom upstairs were hers, and the people she loved could fill the rooms when they came. Evie was walking now, steadily, with the specific determination of a child who has figured out forward motion and is not going to stop practicing it. She had, on her last visit, found her way to the kitchen and had stood in front of the cabinet with the blue and white cups and pointed at them with the certainty of a child who has identified the important thing in a room. The community rooms had been repaired over the summer, the plaster walls replastered, and the floors refinished to the quality they had been in 1962. And June had spent September working with a local garden collective on the grounds. The boxwood properly shaped now, and the camellia revealed, as the old plants they were, decades of growth under the overgrowth. She had said to Cora in August, "There are plants in this garden that have been here longer than either of us have been alive. There is a camellia along the south wall that is at least 40 years old." She said it with the reverence appropriate to the fact. The cedar tree on the south side had been assessed, and was sound, and had been left where it was, pressing against the eave. June had looked at it for a long time, and said, "That tree stayed, and the house stayed around it. That's the deal they made." Cora had said, "Then I suppose we honor the deal." June had nodded, and they had left the cedar tree. 3 local artists had installed work in the community rooms in October, work they had made in response to the Vole collection, which was the kind of response that arrives when the right information is given to the right people. A weaver from Black Mountain, a ceramicist from Weaverville, a painter, young, from right here, who had spent the summer in the Asheville Art Museum's reading room going through the provenance files that David Levy had made available. Her work hung in the largest room on the ground floor, 3 large canvases, and Cora had stood in front of them on the opening day in September before anyone else arrived, and she had felt the continuity that the work was reaching for, the thing that happens when the past is taken seriously enough to speak forward into the present. She had called David Levy after the September opening to tell him about the 3 canvases. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is exactly what the documentation was for." She said, "I know. That is why you made it as complete as you did." She had been thinking for some months about what it meant to have been trusted. Not the practical aspects of the trust, the legal structure of the will, and the responsibility of the collection and the work of the foundation, but the prior thing, the thing Beatrice Vole had decided when she was 93 or 94, watching a woman clean her floors, that this was the right person to give a complicated problem to. She had thought about it from enough angles now to believe she understood it. Beatrice Vole had been watching to see if the work changed when no one was looking. She had been watching to see if the care was real or performed, and she had watched long enough to know the difference. Cora had cleaned the house the same way on the Saturdays when Mrs. Vole sat in the sitting room, and heard her working as she cleaned on the Saturdays when the old woman was upstairs and could not hear anything. She had cleaned the tops of the door frames and the backs of the cabinet shelves and the inside surfaces of the window sills. She had cleaned the parts of the house that no one would ever notice were clean, because she believed that cleaning you could not see was still cleaning you had done, and not done made a difference. She could feel, even when no one else could. This was not admirable. It was just how she was. Beatrice Vole had watched it long enough to trust it. She thought about the 11 years of Saturdays. She thought about Carla on the kitchen table at 8 in the morning in her work uniform, and Mrs. Farnsworth's Christmas cards in the closet, and the reading chairs in the Pendleton house migrating across 2 years toward the center of the room. She thought about the way a house that is trusted with will tell you things, the way space speaks to the person who cares for it, the cool air in February along the east wall of a library in a house on Ridgecrest Road. She had been listening for 11 years without knowing she was listening. She had learned to hear what was in a room. That was what it had been, all of it. 11 years of learning to pay attention to the thing in front of you, which she had done because it was her job, and because she was her father's daughter, and because you did the thing in front of you well, or you did not do it at all, and those 11 years of attention had been what the room was waiting for. She had not known this. You never know, in the middle of the work, what the work is for. You find out later. She found out later. Cora had taken down 2 of the cups and filled them with water and sat Evie in her lap at the kitchen table and let her drink from one of them, which she did with the gravity of a small person performing a ceremony she did not fully understand, but that she understood was significant. She drank the water. She held the cup in both hands the way Mrs. Vole had always held hers. She looked at Cora. Cora looked back. Some things do not need to be explained. They need to be passed on, which is different, and which happens through exactly this kind of ordinary moment in a kitchen in the afternoon. The chamomile tea went cold in her hands on the porch, and she did not notice for a while, because the garden was good and the house was behind her, and the mountains were going blue in the west. When she noticed, she took a last sip and set the cup down on the porch rail. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the July evening, and the sense of something not finished, but rightly in progress. The sense of a person who is where she is supposed to be doing what she is supposed to do. Beatrice Vole had died in February and left her a house. The house had been full of rooms, and some of the rooms had been locked. She had opened them all. She was still opening them, in the sense that a thing you are responsible for is always in the process of being opened, always revealing what it holds as you bring the right attention to it. She had been a cleaner for 11 years, and she had learned in those years to bring the right attention to spaces and surfaces and to the difference between what a thing appeared to be and what it was. She had brought that attention to a library and to an east wall and to a small indentation in the wood, and what she had found was not luck, and it was not reward. It was what happens when a person pays attention with the care they bring to all the things they do, without selecting the ones that seem worth the care in advance. Because the thing about paying attention is that you do not always know in advance which surface is worth examining and which is not, and the only way to find out is to examine them all. She had cleaned other people's floors for 11 years. She had done it right, because doing it right was how she did things. And at the end of 11 years, a woman who had been watching had given her a key in a locked room and a note that said, "Do what is right by it," because doing it right was what she had seen for 3 years, with both eyes open. The apple tree along the east fence would fruit in September. June had said so, and June knew what she was talking about when it came to trees. The kitchen garden was coming in. The library had its books and its desk and its good chair by the fireplace and the shelving unit with the indentation in the wood, and the room below it, empty now of its paintings but not of itself, clean and lit, and kept as Heinrich had kept it for 50 years, waiting for the person who would know what to do with what was in it. She had not counted on any of it. She had counted on the work, which was what she had always counted on, the work in her own hands and the precision that she brought to both. The rest had come because the work was done right. That was the sequence. She had not planned the sequence. It had found her through what she did every day, the way the right things find their way to the people who are ready for them, which is through the work, through the dailiness of the work, through the unremarkable Tuesday of being the person you are in the house in front of you. She had been that person. She had not known she was the right person. She had only been herself, which turned out to be enough. She gathered the cup and went inside. The 9th room she opened was at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway, a small room, 8 feet by 10, with a single window looking north toward the cedar tree. She had avoided it for months, not from reluctance, but from the particular patience she had practiced her whole working life, the understanding that some things reveal their purpose when you are ready for them and not before. She opened it on an August morning 14 months after the letter from Mr. Calloway, when she had worked through most of the house, and only 2 locked doors remained. The other had been a second bathroom, small, with a pedestal sink and a clawfoot tub and tile original to 1924, and she had stood in the bathroom doorway for a moment when she opened it and thought about all the Saturdays she had walked past without knowing it was there. The thought was not uncomfortable. She had not been in the room to know things. She had been in the 5 rooms that were hers to know, and she had known them properly, and that was the work she had been given and the work she had done. The 9th room had a drafting table in it, an old wooden drafting table with adjustable legs of the kind made in the 1930s, the kind built with the assumption that tools should last. The surface was wide and flat, and had a ridge along the bottom to keep work from sliding off, and on it sat a cardboard moving box sealed with tape that had yellowed over the decades to the color of old newspapers. Along the wall were 3 wooden drawers from a flat file, stacked, their contents sealed inside with wax paper. She called June. June came the following morning. They opened the flat file drawers first, carefully, pulling the wax paper back. The drawers contained architectural drawings in pencil on drafting paper, the paper still pale because the wax paper had done what wax paper is made to do. Floor plans, elevation drawings, detailed drawings of the porch brackets and the window surround, and the particular craftsman joinery of the east wing. They were drawings of the house they were standing in, precise and complete, made at some point in the house's life neither of them could place exactly from the drawings themselves, but that the quality of the paper suggested was early, the 1940s perhaps. or late in the previous decade. The cardboard box on the table held garden plans. Formal garden plans, the kind of ambition a person applies to land before they understand what the land is actually going to do. A parterre where the camellia had grown for decades. A symmetrical kitchen garden where the old apple tree now stood in its 40-year asymmetry. A gravel path through a section that was now lawn. June spread the plans across the drafting table and stood over them for a long time without speaking. She said, "Whoever drew these was not wrong. They just hadn't listened to the ground yet." Cora said, "Heinrich." "Probably," June said. "The paper's the right era. He wanted formal. The soil wanted what we have. He must have worked it out. Or the garden worked it out for him, which is also how it goes." They left the drawings on the table. Cora had the elevation drawing and the porch bracket detail framed and hung them in the case she had bought for the second-floor hallway, because they were the house's own record of itself, and the right place for a house's record was the house. The garden plans she gave to June, who had them photographed and kept the originals in the flat file drawers, moved now to her apartment. She said she would use them as a conversation. Something to argue with productively, because the best gardening was always an argument between what you planned and what the ground was prepared to allow. Cora had not replaced her regular clients. She had thought she might, in the first months after the inheritance, that she might keep 3 or 4 of the long-term ones for the shape it would give her days. But the days had filled without the shape, filled with the foundation and the remaining provenance work and the rooms of the house and the correspondence that arrived through the foundation's website, which Priya was managing with the quiet, systematic efficiency of a person who had understood from the first week that an institution's reach is only as wide as its systems. The website had been Priya's idea. She had told Cora in October of the first year, at a Tuesday meeting in the back workroom, "You need a contact form or none of this does what it is supposed to do. People who know something need a way to tell you." Cora had agreed and let her build it, which Priya had done by Thursday. The contact form brought in the Edelman inquiry 14 months after the letter from Mr. Calloway. Roberto Edelman, Sao Paulo. He had read about the Vole collection in an article his daughter found online, and he wanted to ask about a specific work, which he named, a small oil-on-panel, early Dutch period, that had belonged to his great-grandmother in Berlin before the war. He said he had no documentation. He had his great-grandmother's description of the work, passed through 2 generations, and the name of the artist. He wrote, in careful English that was clearly not his first language, "I am only asking." She forwarded the email to David and to Patricia and to Dr. Farr, and they met on a Thursday morning in Patricia's office. David said the description was too specific to be a guess. The proportions, the quality of green in the background, the particular fall of light in the lower left quadrant. These were details a person put in a letter because they were trying to preserve something exactly, because they were afraid of losing even the description if they were not careful enough about it. Patricia said, "The legal standard is one thing. You've already decided the right standard is not always the same one." Cora said, "Get me the best documentation possible and tell me what you find." David flew to Sao Paulo in February. He sat for an afternoon at Roberto Edelman's kitchen table with a box of family correspondence in German that no one in the family could read anymore because the language had not made the crossing with them. David could read it. He emerged from the afternoon with a chronology. 3 letters mentioned the painting directly, by artist, by subject, by its location in the apartment in Berlin, a gift from Roberto's great-great-grandfather to his wife on their 30th wedding anniversary in 1911. David sent the chronology from the airport. Cora read it on the back porch of the house on Ridgecrest Road in February, in her coat, because February in the mountains requires a coat even when you are determined to sit outside. She read it through once, set the phone down, looked at the cedar tree. She called Patricia. Patricia said, "I had the same answer." The painting went to Sao Paulo in April. Roberto Edelman sent a photograph of it on its new wall. The wall of the room he called the best room because the morning light came through the east windows and fell on that wall specifically, and the room was built around that quality of light, which was not something he had planned. His great-grandmother had written in one of the letters that the painting belonged in good morning light. He had not known this when he chose the wall. He learned it from David's translation afterward, and he wrote to Cora. She would know where it is. She would recognize the light. Cora had the photograph printed and framed and hung it in the library at 44 Ridgecrest Road, beside the window on the north wall. It was a photograph of a painting in a room in Sao Paulo, not the painting itself, but the right place for a record of where a thing had gone was the room where the thing had been. That seemed correct to her. She did not examine the instinct further. The instinct was correct. There had also been a family in Vienna who did not want restitution, and this mattered in a different way, one she had spent more time with than she expected to. David had reached them in March of the second year. A grandson, a retired civil engineer in his mid-60s who had looked at the documentation carefully and written back in German, translated by David, saying that his grandmother had considered the sale a fair transaction at the time, that she had received what she believed was a fair price and had been grateful for it, and that returning the painting 60 years later would not undo what had happened and would not serve any purpose he could give a name to. He asked only that the painting be kept where people could see it. She had read this and sat with it for 2 days. Not uncertainty about what to do, because he had told her what to do, but something else, the specific quality of a situation that does not resolve in the way you expected, and that requires you to recalibrate what resolution means. She had called David on the 3rd day and said, "He gets to decide. We keep it. We keep his name and his decision in the file, with his permission, and we keep the painting in the exhibition with the record of his family's choice, and that is what we do." David said, "Yes." The wall text beside the painting noted that the family had been contacted and had elected to leave the work in the collection, and gave the family name, which the grandson had given permission to use. The text was 5 lines. The 5 lines told the truth and nothing else. In September, a class of 4th graders from a school on the west side of Asheville came to the community rooms on a Wednesday morning, 14 children with their teacher, who had arranged it through Priya's education program. The children moved through the rooms with the contained intensity that children bring to unfamiliar buildings, touching nothing, but looking at everything with the thoroughness of people who have not yet learned that looking carefully is unusual. One boy stopped in front of the framed elevation drawing of the house, the east facade in pencil on drafting paper, and stood looking at it for a while with the expression of someone comparing what was in the frame to what they had passed coming in. He said, to nobody specifically, "It's the same house." His teacher said, "That's right. That's a drawing of this house from a long time ago." He looked at the drawing. He looked at the window. He looked at the drawing again. He said, "It's still the same." Cora was in the hallway when this happened, coming from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea for Priya and Patricia in the workroom, and she stood for a moment before moving on. She thought, "Yes, that is the idea." She did not say this aloud because he was a 4th grader and the statement was complete as it stood and did not need her to agree with it. Polly came up from Charlotte in April of the 2nd year for the museum's 1st anniversary program. She brought Marcus and Evie. Evie was 2.5 and was at the age where the world presents itself as a series of surfaces requiring investigation, and she investigated the floors of 44 Ridgecrest Road with the systematic patience of a person conducting thorough research. She sat on the kitchen floor. She sat in the hall. She sat in the doorway of the sitting room and announced, with the authority of a 2.5-year-old, that this one was cold. The sitting room floor was cold in April. Cora confirmed that it was. June took Evie into the kitchen garden, which was coming back from winter with the particular insistence of things that know where they are supposed to be. The herbs were up along the south wall. The tomato seedlings sat on the porch in their trays. The old apple tree had its blossoms out, white and small, and the smell of apple blossoms in April, which is a smell that exists for about 10 days and then is gone until the following year. June held Evie up to the lowest branch so she could smell them. Cora watched from the kitchen door. She thought about what she had thought about often in those 14 months, which was that the things you pass on are rarely the things you intend to pass on. She had intended to pass on the practical things, how to handle money with care, how to work without complaint, how to get through the years when getting through is the main project. She had tried to teach these things and had sometimes succeeded and sometimes approximated. But the things that had actually passed were different, and she could see them from this distance. June holding Evie up to the blossoms without calculating whether to do it, knowing that this was the thing you did when you had a child and an apple tree in April. The hands that knew the ground. The specific quality of attention that lives in a person before it has a name, and that shows itself not in the things a person says, but in the way they move through a space they care about. These had not been taught. They had been demonstrated, daily, in the doing of the work, and they had crossed the way things cross between people who spend time together honestly, without announcement, through the simple fact of presence. She went back inside and put the kettle on. The chamomile grew in the kitchen garden by the second fall, along the south wall in the full afternoon sun where June had put it the previous spring. She had not been asked to plant it. She had looked at the wall and the sun and the cups in the high cabinet, and she had planted it, and by October it was well established, the flat yellow flowers and the particular smell when you brush the stems, clean and mild. Cora cut some on a Saturday morning and dried it in the workroom, on a screen she had bought for the purpose, with the south window open for the dry October air to do what October air does. She made the first tea from it 2 weeks later. She took the 2 blue and white cups from the high cabinet and filled them both. She carried them to the sitting room the way she had always carried them and set one on the end table beside the chair where Mrs. Vole had sat and held the other in her hands and looked at the room. She had been in the sitting room on 156 Saturdays over 3 years, and then on the Saturdays and weekday evenings and occasional Tuesday mornings of 14 months as its owner, and the room had not changed materially in all that time. The same proportions, the same afternoon light through the west window at this hour. The German radio that she had stopped turning on because it was Mrs. Vole's radio, and she would not have been able to say what she was listening for, hearing it without her. Some things belonged to the person and went with the person, and what remained was the shape of the person in the room, which was its own kind of presence. She had learned this in 11 years of cleaning other people's homes. The room holds the person after the person is gone, the way a cup holds the warmth after the tea is finished. She drank the tea. It was good. It was what it had always been, which was the right thing in the right cup in the right room. She washed the cup and dried it, and put it back in the high cabinet beside the other one. She went to the workroom and opened the foundation file for the week, the correspondence and the accounts and the grant applications from 2 organizations that Priya had flagged as strong candidates for the spring funding round. She made a column on a yellow legal pad, the way she had always made columns on yellow legal pads, and she began to work through it, one thing at a time. The cedar tree pressed against the porch eave in the October wind. The chamomile was drying on its screen. The apple tree along the east fence had done what June said it would do in September, which was fruit, abundantly, more than they could use, and June had made 2 batches of preserves from it, and given jars to each of the community room's regular visitors, and to Ms. Caldwell, whose 4th grade class had come in September, and to Roberto Edelman's daughter, who was visiting from Sao Paulo that week on other business, and who had come to see the house and the library and the space where the painting had waited. She had stood in the library for a while, looking at the shelves, and she had said, "My father says to tell you the light is right." She means the photograph on the wall. He says every morning it is the right light. Cora had given her a jar of apple preserves for him. She worked through the foundation file and made her notes. Outside the window, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons do in the mountains, going golden and then going blue, the light changing its mind about what it wanted to be. She worked until the light went, and then she turned the lamp on and kept working. The house was still the same house. The work was still the work. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.